Imagine the time period of 1965. You're a person of color, most likely an African American, and you're trying to get your opinion heard about the government and you want to vote. Sadly and unsurprisingly, you are not allowed to vote because of your skin color, and most of the time, you would get beat for trying to exercise your First Amendment. Good day, everyone. My name is Anthony Miranda, and today we're going to educate ourselves on an event that succeeded at changing the United States as we know it. Today I will be talking about the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Before you learn about the Voting Rights Act of 1965, you should know that the events that inspired it. Between the 1950s and the 1960s, racism, inequality, and injustice was the norm at the time. A good percentage of people did not care about equality or making things right, probably because the people that did not care were the people that were not affected by inequality or racism. But only after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech the year before, and the amount of African Americans protesting for equal rights did the Voting Rights Act really start going into motion. The photo shown here is an example of a civil rights protest in 1964. With all the mentioning of the Voting Rights Act, it prompts the question, what exactly is the Voting Rights Act? To briefly state it, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a law to enforce the 15th Amendment. The goal of the law was to end discrimination that blacks faced at the voting polls, like literacy tests, poll taxes, and physical violence. The need for such a law was made evident after voting rights activists were murdered. The act had an immediate impact because by the end of 1965, about 250,000 black people registered as voters. Now that you know what the Voting Rights Act is, you will be able to understand the strides taken to achieve it. There were many people that tried to endorse the Voting Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act, and overall equality for everyone. One main course of action African Americans took is simply just protesting. Hundreds, maybe even thousands of African Americans would take their signs and their pride to the streets to protest against inequality, racism, and injustice. At the time, discriminatory practices were put in effect to stop African Americans from protesting. Those who were protesting were usually prone to being assaulted, beat, whipped, discriminated, and for the most part treated like absolute garbage. The March on Selma was a turning point in the fight for equal rights, and showing the people of the South how far these Negroes would go for equality among all of them. Starting on the 7th of March and being led by Martin Luther King Jr. himself, about 600 African Americans went on protest, marching from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama. And when the march first started, there was a roadblock comprising of Alabama state troopers who attacked the protesters with nightsticks, tear gas, and whips after they refused to turn back. This horrific day during the march would be known as Bloody Sunday. Even after this traumatizing event, the protesters kept marching, but this time they were backed by a U.S. Court District Judge, addressed by the President Lyndon Johnson. The about 600 protesters had increased to around 2,000 protesters, now being protected by the army troops. By the time the marchers arrived at Montgomery, the number of protesters increased to a staggering 50,000 people, comprising of both black and white people. During the events leading up to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of people that contributed to the cause. However, there are some remarkably famous people that did contribute to the African Americans' causes. One such person is a man known for his I Have a Dream speech, the peace movement, and the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr. What Mr. King did that contributed to the Voting Rights Act is that he led the march from Selma to Montgomery. Another important person involved in the Voting Rights Act is President Lyndon Johnson. President Johnson is actually the man responsible for both sending troops to defend the protesters marching from Selma and Montgomery, as well as being the one to sign the Voting Rights Act into law. From marching for equal rights to getting beat for even mentioning justice, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 has truly changed the United States as we know it. Its results greatly increased the diversity between black and white voters in the U.S. and allowed a greater number of African Americans to enter political life at the local, state, and even the national level. At the end of the day, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is just one of many representations of what organization and dedication among people can lead to. These are my works cited slides, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation. Thank you.